Hi, my name is Paul Messplay. I'm the University Budget Director here at Mary Washington. In February, I gave a presentation at the University Faculty Council that spoke to the budget constraints that face the university and why we have a need to undergo a strategic resource allocation process. At the request of the UFC, I'm doing this podcast so that faculty and staff who were unable to attend the UFC meeting will be able to view the presentation. So let's get started. In December, President Hurley announced that the university would be undertaking a strategic resource allocation process beginning this spring and continuing into the fall of 2013. As President Hurley noted, the driving force behind this effort is the need to identify resources to help make UMW distinctive through strategic investment in existing programs and the creation of new programs that will increase our competitiveness. A strategic resource allocation process is needed for two key reasons. First, after several years of state funding cuts and efforts to maximize efficiency, UMW's operating budget just does not have sufficient flexibility to go much beyond what we're doing today. Second, the key traditional revenue sources, tuition and state general fund support, will be very limited going forward. So what I'd like to do in this presentation is, first of all, we'll take a look at the summary of the operating budget, just to get everyone into the same ballpark. And then we'll look at an overview of the current operating budget environment, in particular the state funding trends and the state financing policy, our enrollment and the related tuition rates and associated revenue, and finally the Higher Education Opportunity Act. So let's take a look at the operating budget to begin with. The 2012-13 operating budget for the University of Mary Washington totals $103 million. You can see at the top of this screen we have the sources, and at the bottom of the screen the budgeted uses of those funds. A lot of folks, a comment that I often get is, well, with a $103 million budget, it would seem to me that we should have sufficient flexibility to do just about anything we want to do. But the reality is we don't have a single bucket. Our operating budget is really comprised of 6 separate fund groups. And briefly, I'll walk through those. Educational and general programs, this is where our main instructional programs are housed, as well as related support, such as the library, dean's offices, administration, campus safety, grounds and facilities. One of the key things to note here about the E&G budget is we're pretty much locked into using E&G funds within the E&G budget. In other words, we really don't have much flexibility in moving them elsewhere. In fact, we are prohibited from using any state funds to support our Auxiliary Enterprises program, which is in the second column of this spreadsheet. Auxiliary enterprises are primarily self-supporting business operations. They include housing, dining, and the bookstore. And you'll see on the revenue section of that column that we receive no general fund support, no state taxpayer dollars for auxiliary services. The comprehensive fee budget is supported by a mandatory fee to all students. It's really comprised of 2 separate fees, one that supports the E&G budget, in those items back in the first column, and the second component of the comprehensive fee supports other auxiliary programs that are not funded by a standalone revenue source. Examples there being things like intercollegiate athletics and student recreation programs. Both of those activities are funded through the comp fee auxiliary budget. Student financial assistance, really, this is comprised of primarily need-based financial aid. We get about $1.7 million from the state for need-based aid for undergraduate students. And then the $2.8 million that you see on the grants and contracts line represent federal financial aid programs, the largest of which is Pell Grants. Museums and cultural services. These are the budgets for Belmont, the Gary Melcher's home, and the James Monroe Museum. You can see there's general funds appropriated for those activities, and there's about $306,000 in other revenue that the museums themselves generate through admissions and ticket sales and events. And then finally, when you see the higher education centers, that is entirely our Dahlgren campus. It's supported by state general funds and self-generated revenues. One thing to note here is that Dahlgren does pay the university an overhead rate that goes back in to support our comp fee budget. Otherwise, the funding in the higher education centers is restricted to just the Dahlgren campus operations. When we look at the strategic resource allocation process, then our focus is going to be largely on those first three columns: E&G programs, auxiliary enterprises, and the comprehensive fee budget. And of those three, I think the greatest emphasis will most likely be on the E&G programs and the comp fee budget, especially that part of the comp fee budget that supports E&G programs. So let's look at the composition of the E&G revenue budget plus the E&G comp fee. As you can see, it's largely driven by student tuition and fees and general fund support. There's a little bit of other revenue, 2%. That's primarily for things like the orientation fee. We have library fines in there. We also have miscellaneous rental income. But overall, I think the key point here is that our E&G budget is really dominated between tuition and state general fund support. If you break that E&G budget down a little bit further, you can see that personal services represent about 76% of the total E&G budget. The remaining 24% are non-personal services or our general operating budget. But one thing to remember about the non-personal services component is that about 1/3 of that budget is for unavoidable operating costs such as utilities, insurance, contracts, licenses, and leases. So in that sense, you're really limited in what you can do and the amount of flexibility you have. So let's, with this brief overview, let's start looking at some of the components that are affecting our state budget. State funding. This chart shows the trends in state general fund support for E&G programs. Remember now, we don't get any general funds for auxiliary programs, nor is there anything in the comprehensive fee from the general fund. So this is just to our E&G programs. It's pretty apparent that it's a relatively unstable revenue source for the university, up and down. The up and downs tend to follow the state's economy. When the recession hits, higher ed is usually one of the larger targets. That's primarily because we are one of the larger pieces of the state budget, and we have the ability to raise revenue. So the General Assembly doesn't feel quite so bad about making cuts to higher education, knowing that they'll be able to recoup at least a portion of those state cuts by bumping up their tuition rates. But the key thing here is that because, as we just saw, so much of our budget has a lot of fixed and personnel costs, that it's really hard to manage our budget when you have these up and down revenue swings like that. And that makes it all the more difficult to have any kind of flexibility or making adjustments on the fly to revenue changes. The other key point here is that if you look at FY13, the very last column, that's the current fiscal year, we're at about $19.2 million. You can see that that's just barely above where we were 11 years ago at $18.8 million. Now, certainly we've had a lot more cost on the general fund side than just $400,000 over that year. In fact, if you look just at state mandated tuition increases and state mandated fringe benefit rates over that time period, those costs added about $2.7 million to the budget. So if you're looking just at discretionary revenue from the general fund, there really is none. In fact, it's gone down over that last 11 years or so. It's not really getting a complete picture if you just look at our total general fund support. You've also got to look at our in-state enrollment. And that is because that's how we're funded. We receive general funds for our in-state students. We do not receive anything for out-of-state students. So you've got to track enrollment changes as well, and over this time period from FY99 to FY13, our enrollment has grown fairly steadily, and you can see what that impact is. In FY99, we were receiving $5,283 for each in-state student FTE, or full-time equivalent. Today, in this fiscal year, we're receiving $4,817. These are real dollars, represented by the blue line. If you look at the red line, I've adjusted those amounts for the CPI for all urban consumers. And you can see the drop, of course, is even more dramatic when you take into account inflation. We've gone from $5,283 to this year $3,131 per in-state student. This chart takes that same information about the per student in-state funding, represented by the blue line, and overlays our full-time tuition charge for that same time period. So you can see that a lot of what our strategy has been, and I'll mention that this chart, if you do the same kind of thing for just about any other higher education institution, you're going to have the same overall look, basically. And that's that we've been replacing general funds with tuition revenue. And so you see the tuition line, which is in red, and the general fund support per in-state student, the blue line. The red line has a pretty steady ramp up. In fact, it's increased 141% between FY99 and FY13, whereas the CPI, the rate of inflation, has increased by 40%. And so you can see that's where a lot of concern comes from the public and the General Assembly, is the fact that tuition has outpaced CPI, the CPI so rapidly. One other comment on this, if you look at the combination of general fund support and tuition revenue. Let's start with FY99. General fund support was $5,283. That's the 66% line, and 34% was the tuition at $2,682. So the total cost, or the total funding source between those two, was $7,965, 66% coming from the general fund and 34% coming from tuition. Now, if you fast forward to FY13, you can see that those two lines have crossed, where tuition now pays the larger share at 57% and tuition is at 43%. The total cost between those two items is $11,285. This increase from FY99 to FY13 is about 38%, or a couple percentage points below CPI. So it's not so much that the cost of education has grown that dramatically compared to the CPI. The issue is that the cost to the student has grown so rapidly. And that continues to be a concern for everyone, and we'll talk a little bit more about state tuition policy in the next group of slides. So, state financing policy. The state has indicated, or has a goal of funding in-state students at a rate of 67% from general funds and 33% from the student. So in other words, the state will kick in 67% of the cost of education and the student would pay 33%. Well, as you can see, what we just looked at, those lines have gotten a little bit out of whack. Instead, the student is paying 57% and the Commonwealth is paying 43%. For out-of-state students, as I mentioned a little earlier, the state says that they will not pay anything towards the cost of an out-of-state student. And in fact, the out-of-state student must pay 100% of the cost of their education. And just a little side note here, auxiliary enterprise, the same idea, housing, dining, bookstore, which are really outside of the core mission of a university. That we receive no state funding for those operations. Now, we start kind of going off a little bit here on the cost sharing rate, which is really a function of the state's financing policy of the 6733, but instead they build into this the revenue that we're able to generate from our non-resident students, so that as new costs come up, such as a state mandated salary increase or state mandated fringe benefit rate changes, this is how they fund those changes for higher education. For UMW in particular, for say a salary increase, we'll receive 56% of the E&G costs through general funds and 44% from tuition and fee or non-general funds. So this is largely a function to a great degree of your mix of in-state and out-of-state students. And I've just put some other schools down here as example what their cost sharing rates are, and you can see those schools with a high out-of-state enrollment such as UVA have a much smaller general fund share for these kinds of costs at 38%, and 62% of the costs are expected to be covered from tuition and other revenues. Now, why is this important? Because it really affects the tuition increase that we recommend to our board and implement for our students. For example, here are the state mandated cost increases that we're aware of so far for next fiscal year. It looks like there's going to be a 3% salary increase and at least a 12% increase in health insurance. These are the employer costs, not the employees. So these are costs borne by the university. So for a 3% salary increase, we're estimating a cost of about $1.2 million, and health insurance $597,000, for a total of $1.8 million in new costs next year just for those two items. Now, applying the cost share ratio that we just looked at 56-44, 56% general funds, 44% tuition and fees, the university's costs will be $803,000, and the balance will come from the general fund, a little bit over $1 million. Now, to generate $803,000 requires a 2.2% tuition increase. Why does this matter? Because the governor has stated that he doesn't want to see a tuition increase greater than the rate of inflation, and he puts this pressure on boards of visitors, and boards of visitors in turn put that pressure on university administrators. Well, if we're looking at the rate of inflation of say 3%, and we already know that we're going to have mandated state cost increases that are going to eat up 2.2% of that, that leaves us with a remaining capacity of about 0.8% in terms of a tuition increase, or $290,000 to address all other costs. Now that doesn't give us much room. In fact, just the utilities, which we have to keep our lights on and keep the heat going and the air conditioning, will increase probably $120,000 next year. So there's a big chunk of that $290,000. Doesn't leave a whole lot for anything else that we have in terms of operation and maintenance of our facilities, contracts, leases, insurance, let alone any other kind of priorities that the president may want to move forward with. So let's look now at enrollment and our tuition and fees. This chart tracks our full-time equivalent enrollment history by residency from 1998-99, first group of bars on the left, to 2012-2013. And you can see the red represents out-of-state students and the blue bar represents in-state students. And if you move over to about 2001, 2002, you can see that was the high point of our out-of-state enrollment. We were at 1,187 students. Those have rather rapidly declined up to today, where we've got an estimated 542 out-of-state FTE. So we've lost more than half of our out-of-state students in the last 11 years. At the same time, our in-state numbers have been growing, and that's what drove a lot of that chart we looked at earlier in terms of our state funding per in-state FTE. That's why that chart has been affected as dramatically as it has, because of the in-state growth. But let's just focus on the out-of-state for right now. That has made a real revenue hit, that loss of out-of-state students for the university. Why? Because out-of-state students pay about $12,000 more than an in-state student. This table shows the tuition and fee rates for in-state students. In the first column, $18,086 for a full-time student over the academic year, compared to what a out-of-state student would pay, approximately $30,400. Now, all the fees and housing and board costs are the same whether you're in-state or out-of-state, but the tuition is where we pick up the big difference there. So why? It's not just the revenue, the extra revenue, which is nice, but it's also those out-of-state students are helping to subsidize our in-state students. And here's why. As I mentioned earlier, we're required to charge at least 100% of the cost of education to our out-of-state students, not just Mary Washington, but all the institutions in Virginia. Each year, SCHEV does a calculation and produces the table that you see here that compares what the estimated costs are. It's a blended number for each institution, and then compares that to their average non-resident tuition rate. And then you can see what percentage that tuition rate is of cost. So overall, Virginia institutions charge their out-of-state students 153% of the cost. Mary Washington's at 137%. So yes, we're generating more revenue, but we're also helping, our out-of-state students are helping to cover that funding gap from the shortfall in state funds. So just hypothetically, to get an idea of what kind of numbers we're looking at, if you look at this year's FTE, total enrollment, in-state, out-of-state, first column on this table, we're at 4,527. Just for illustrative purposes, I've assumed that in the next column that we maintained our high point in out-of-state FTE, so that we're at 1,187, and what I've done is reduce the in-state number so that we get to the same total. So there's no change in total enrollment, just a shift between in-state to out-of-state of 645 students. Then I multiplied that by the 2012-13 tuition rates, and so if we reduce in-state students by 645, we have a tuition revenue impact of a loss of $3 million. On the other hand, if we were to increase our out-of-state or held them steady since 2001, 2002, we would be generating an additional almost $11 million. So the net change between those two is nearly $8 million. That's a significant amount of revenue that we've lost, an opportunity lost, so to speak. And it represents about 26% of our 2012-2013 tuition revenue budget. Now, I'm often asked, well, are we doing anything that much different from other schools in terms of our tuition increase that's helping drive some of our revenue issues? And the answer is no. And what this chart shows is looking at the change in tuition rates, the dollar change from 1998-99 up to 2012-13. UMW is the blue line, and the average of all other Virginia universities is the red line. And you can see that generally we follow what the other universities are doing. Some years we're a little bit higher than the other schools, and some years we're a little bit lower. You may be wondering about the big drop in 99-2000. That was under Governor Gilmore. All higher education institutions were required to reduce their tuition for in-state students by 20%. That was kind of realigning that fund split issue between state funds and student tuition, which worked fairly well for about a year or two. And then you can see the recessions hit, and the general funds were lost, and the tuition revenue or the tuition increases started peaking again. I will say too that in terms of that 20% reduction in tuition, we got the equivalent amount of revenue in additional general fund support. So there was no revenue loss. It was revenue neutral by that action. But over this time period, as you see in the block, UMW's average increase has been $379 a year, compared to all other universities at $388. So we've been about $9 on average lower than the rest of the Virginia institutions. So where do we stand in tuition? This chart compares UMW's tuition rates, tuition and fees, highlighted in yellow, with all the other public universities in Virginia. And it's broken down by various categories. The first block is in-state commuter. And what we've done here is for each of the categories ranked the tuition or the tuition and fees charge from high to low. So in the in-state commuter, VMI has the highest rate at $13,835, and Norfolk State has the lowest at $6,760. We come in right about number 9. And I'll tell you, over the years, looked back at this for many years, and we've held pretty steady right at about number 9 in terms of in-state commuters. Out of state, same thing. We've pretty much held our own. We're coming in at 11, high to low, UVA at the highest, Virginia State at the lowest. Room and board, we're currently at number 6. We've actually gone up a couple spaces in the last year or two, and that's because we've been ramping up our housing rates in order to cover the debt service for the major renovations we did at Randolph and Mason Halls. But if you look at our total in-state grouping at 18,086, we're still right at number 9, a little bit below the midpoint. And same with out-of-state, number 11 out of the 15 schools. I want to look just briefly at the Higher Education Opportunity Act. This was enacted by the 2011 General Assembly, so it's about 2 years old now. And its primary goal, and the one that's been most publicized, has been to increase the number of new undergraduate degrees by the year 2025 by 100,000. It also looked at some of the other higher education funding issues, per student funding, need-based student aid, and the establishment of a higher education rainy day fund. But the one thing I want to really focus on is the requirement that each institution prepare a 6-year plan each year. As I note here, the 6-year plans are required by all institutions. The 6-year plans have both mandatory and optional components. Each 6-year plan must have a strategy to mitigate the impact of tuition increases, strategies to increase year-round use of facilities, instructional resource sharing strategies with other schools, and quality improvements. Optional components, you can see it's increase enrollment, increased degrees, increased degree production in STEM-H, which has generated a lot of press in terms of all the requirements of the 6-year plan. That one has seemed to have picked up a lot of a lot of interest. Increased use of technology, enhanced instruction, expand economic development opportunities, and increase research funding. Now, why is the 6-year plan important? Because since the passage of the Higher Education Opportunity Act, or TJ21 it's also referred to as, institutional state budget requests are limited to those initiatives identified in its 6-year plans. So no longer is the door flung wide open and we can go in and request anything we want. Now we can only request state funding for those things that are presented in our 6-year plan. So the extent to which our 6-year plan initiatives vary from what the institution's priorities may happen to be in a given year, that makes it all the more difficult in terms of achieving state funding for those initiatives. And the funding initiatives too, or the new funding from the state has tended to follow the 6-year plans or the Higher Education Opportunity Act objectives. And you can see this is the governor's budget recommendations for next year. And you can see the extra money that has gone to higher education as recommended by the governor, about $19.5 million. And the allocation of those funds between degree incentives, enrollment growth, base adequacy, financial aid, and institution-specific initiatives addressing TJ21 initiatives. And then in the last column is the funding recommendations for the University of Mary Washington. Another requirement, although not directly related to TJ21, but something that's been picked up on by the governor, is that as a way to leverage his additional state funds, he's been requiring institutions to reallocate a portion of their funds specifically to support TJ21 objectives. For the current year, we've been required to reallocate $270,930 for TJ21 objectives, and the original budget for next year had a requirement of $361,240. Then the governor's budget came out in December 2012, and he had recommended that those reallocation requirements be increased pretty substantially for UMW from $361,000 to $903,000. Right now in the General Assembly, they're going to finish up later this week. They've both given the institutions a little more flexibility and are really recommending reallocations back to the original amount of $361,000. Regardless, that's just another requirement on the university's operating budget in terms of how we allocate resources and really limiting some of the things that we can do if some of our priorities or initiatives are outside of our 6-year plan or the objectives of TJ21. One other point here on the reallocations is that reallocations cannot come from tuition and fee increases. So we can't just bump up tuition to meet our reallocation requirement. We have to actually reallocate existing budget to fund the TJ21 initiatives, and we have to demonstrate that to the Secretary of Education. So finally, just to kind of reiterate or summarize what we've gone through, some of the strategic resource allocation pressures or some of those factors that are moving us in that direction are, of course, our state funding. As we noted, it's a very unstable funding source, and we really do not anticipate any significant new funding in the next year or probably the next couple of years. So we're going to be pretty much on our own in that regard. Tuition, there's a real strong pressure to keep tuition increases low, and by the time we address some of the other state mandated costs, we just don't have much capacity left in the incremental tuition revenue that we can generate and still maintain some level of compliance with meeting the limitation to the rate of inflation. Enrollment, we're not a rapidly growing institution, or we don't anticipate significant enrollment growth, so overall limited growth there. And of course, we still have the uncertainty of our out-of-state enrollments, and we've seen what the impact that can have on our operating budget. And then finally, the Higher Education Opportunity Act, the fact that that requires some targeted funding, and then the extra pressure that it's put on our operating budget because of the reallocation requirements. So that concludes the presentation. If you have any questions about the presentation or would like additional information, please feel free to contact me. My email address and phone number are here. And also, I would encourage you to visit the UMW Budget Office webpage. We try to keep updated information on what's going on with the General Assembly and our state funding, as well as a lot of historical information on our operating budgets and various tuition and fee reports. So again, please feel free to call me if you have any questions. Thank you.